Tonight, Bath holds its breath. In a chandeliered gallery, music soars, until the ceiling groans, the crowd gasps, and a maid's hand closes around a duke's sleeve. One touch ignites a scandal, and with it, a fuse, a past buried in ledgers, a promise bound by grief, and an impossible choice between duty and desire. She was meant to vanish in the shadows. He was meant to marry for power. But fate has other plans, and a secret is about to split the room like falling plaster. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from. And one question: what do you love most about period romances? The forbidden longing, the glittering ballrooms, or the moment truth conquers society? Bath, England, in the year 1862, shimmered beneath a cold spring rain that left the cobblestones of the Crescent slick and luminous. Gas lamps glowed through the mist like amber pearls, and carriages rolled toward a grand townhouse where a musicale promised to eclipse every other event of the season. Within its high-ceilinged drawing room, 100 candles quivered in their sconces, casting tremulous light over plaster medallions, gilt-framed mirrors, and the careful arrangements of musicians tuning their instruments. The scent of beeswax polish mingled with violets and damp wool cloaks left in the vestibule. Among the quiet bustle, Mina Havers moved unseen, her dark grey wool dress brushing the polished parquet, a white linen apron drawn tight at her slender waist. Her muslin cap framed the delicate oval of her face, but could not hide the warm chestnut sheen of hair braided neatly at the nape of her neck. She had been a housemaid for over a decade and had perfected the art of blending with the panelling, of stepping forward only when summoned. Her hazel eyes, steady and observant, flicked across the room not in curiosity but in vigilance. She was responsible for candles, for fresh water, for ensuring that the unseen labour holding this grandeur together did not falter. The guests glittered like a living constellation. Jewels winked at throats and wrists, silk skirts swelled and whispered, gentlemen in black frock coats murmured behind gloved hands. Near the musicians stood the Duke of Wrentham, Julian Ashford, a tall, severe figure in a black wool coat, a muted burgundy waistcoat, and a cravat knotted with impeccable precision. His dark hair, swept back from his temples, bore faint threads of grey that gave him a sombre distinction. His face was pale and composed, his gaze distant, as though he were here only out of obligation. There was something in the set of his jaw, a hint of exhaustion, a man weighed down by duty more than by years. Mina had glimpsed him once before, striding across the marble floor of another house, but only in passing. Tonight, she could not look away, not because he was a duke. Titles had never impressed her, but because a man so self-contained seemed somehow fragile beneath the plastered grandeur. He watched the musicians tune with the detachment of a man who no longer hears music. The performance began, a lilting waltz swelling beneath the frescoed ceiling. Mina retreated to the side of the room, ready to extinguish a candle that sputtered near a heavy velvet curtain. Her fingers trembled slightly from the heat. She stepped back, tilting her head. Something in the ceiling above, a faint groan, a whisper of plaster, made her freeze. She looked up. The ornate medallion at the center of the ceiling bulged like a breath held too long. She glanced at the guests, but no one saw. They were lost in the music. Only she, the invisible servant, recognized danger. Her hazel eyes darted to the Duke. He stood directly beneath the medallion, hands clasped behind his back, face turned toward the violins. For a heartbeat, Mina hesitated. Then she crossed the polished floor without thought, her boots silent on the parquet. "Your Grace," she murmured, but the music swallowed her voice. She seized his arm with both hands and tugged. He stiffened, startled, his dark eyes flashing down at her just as a piece of plaster the size of a dinner plate cracked free and crashed where he had been standing. Gasps rippled through the room. The violins shrieked to a halt. Dust drifted like pale snow. Julian looked at the shattered plaster, then at Mina. She still clutched his sleeve, her small hand trembling against the fine wool. He said nothing, only studied her with a gaze so intense she felt it burn through the muslin of her cap. She dropped her hand and stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. Around them, guests whispered, "The maid, the duke, did you see?" Their curiosity sharp as needles. The musicians lowered their instruments. A footman rushed forward, eyes wide. Someone called for the steward, but Julian did not move. His dark eyes remained on Mina, and in them she saw not anger, but something more dangerous. A flicker of recognition, of interest, as though the invisible maid had suddenly taken shape. She curtsied low, hoping to dissolve back into anonymity, but the room had already changed. The whispers would not be forgotten. The sight of her hand upon his arm, the way he had allowed it, would travel through Bath by morning. She straightened, clutching her apron to still its tremor, and turned away. Behind her, Julian Ashford lifted his head. His expression had altered, the reserve cracking just enough to reveal a man startled into awareness. He glanced up at the gaping hole in the ceiling, then back at the retreating figure of the maid who had saved him. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest, a quickening not of fear, but of possibility. In that glittering room, beneath the echo of a broken ceiling and the hiss of snuffed candles, a single moment had shifted the axis of both their lives. Neither knew yet what form it would take, but the gaze they shared across the dust-filled air was as palpable as a vow. The carriage wheels groaned as they passed beneath the high stone arch of Ashford House. The sky, cast in the pale grey of an English afternoon, hung heavy above the estate, its silence broken only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the occasional caw of a distant crow. The great iron gates had parted without fanfare, but as the carriage rolled to a halt in the gravel drive, Mina Havers felt the world tilt. She had crossed thresholds before, kitchens, pantries, back stairwells, but never one so formidable, never as a wife, never as a duchess. Ashford House, seat of the Dukes of Wrentham for over 3 centuries, loomed above her like a slumbering creature carved in grey stone. Its windows reflected no light. The facade, elegant and stern, was softened only by trailing ivy and the worn steps leading to the entrance, each one hollowed slightly in the centre by time and footsteps that came long before hers. When the footman opened the door, Mina hesitated. Not visibly, her hands remained still in her lap, but deep within, something fragile fluttered. She adjusted her gloves. The dress she wore, her first as a duchess, was a deep navy merino wool with buttons of jet and a modest lace collar. She had chosen it with care, dignified, simple, a bridge between 2 worlds. She stepped down onto the gravel, the sound of her boots too loud in the hush that fell over the courtyard. A line of servants stood to receive her as custom demanded. Housekeeper, butler, footman, maids. Their postures were perfect, their eyes unreadable. Mina looked at them and knew each pair of hands had scrubbed or polished, or ordered the very rooms she now belonged to. A younger version of herself might have stood among them, and now they bowed, not deeply, not with warmth, but with that strained courtesy reserved for something unexpected. The butler, a tall man with a long face and powdered hair, stepped forward. "Your Grace," he said with a voice smooth as wax. "Welcome to Ashford House." Mina inclined her head, not daring yet to smile. The entrance hall swallowed her whole. Dark wood panelling, thick Persian rugs, and high ceilings frescoed with scenes of faded mythology enclosed her in silence. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashfords, their expressions proud, remote, and suspiciously alike. Her own reflection blinked at her from the gilded mirror above the console. Pale, composed, not quite real. The butler murmured something about the drawing room, but Mina barely heard. At the top of the sweeping staircase, a figure in black bombazine, slender and still, stood watching. Her white hair was drawn into a severe bun, her hands hidden in black gloves. The Dowager Duchess of Wrentham, widow and mistress of the house until now. Her presence stilled even the dust in the air. Julian, who had not spoken during the journey, ascended 2 steps and addressed his mother with a voice as formal as prayer. "Mother, may I present Mina?" The dowager did not descend. She simply looked, first at her son, then at the woman beside him. "A pleasure, I am sure," she said, her tone neither cruel nor kind. She turned and disappeared down the corridor like a spectre slipping through stone. Mina released a breath she had not realized she held. The rest of the day passed in a haze of muted voices, awkward introductions, and distant footsteps echoing through long corridors. Mina was shown to her rooms, not Julian's, of course, but a suite of her own overlooking the east gardens, where bare trees clawed at the sky. The chamber was elegant, with damask drapes and rosewood furniture, yet it felt untouched, as if waiting for someone else. A fire had been lit, but no warmth reached her fingertips. She removed her gloves slowly, her hands stiff from the cold. The mirror above the fireplace reflected a woman she did not quite recognize, upright, composed, yet adrift. Julian had not joined her. He had disappeared into his study after a brief, polite inquiry as to her comfort. He had bowed slightly when he left. She had curtsied. They might have been strangers passing in a ballroom. She explored the house cautiously, taking slow steps through the endless halls. The household operated with the smooth silence of a place too long governed by routine and grief. Candles were trimmed, clocks ticked. The ticking felt louder than speech. The servants, when they passed her, dipped shallow curtsies and murmured, "Your Grace," with practiced lips. But she saw the glances, heard the hushes. It was not cruelty, it was distance. By evening, the oppressive hush had thickened. A storm gathered outside, and wind pressed against the windows like hands searching for a way in. Mina walked the corridor outside the steward's office, drawn by the scent of old paper and beeswax. The door was ajar. No one was within. She stepped inside. The room was lined with shelves, ledgers, estate documents, labeled boxes. A large mahogany desk dominated the center, its surface immaculate but oddly lifeless. The lamplight cast long shadows. Mina ran her fingers lightly over the smooth wood and paused at the top right drawer. It was not locked. Inside, tucked between folded parchment and a cracked inkwell, was a sealed envelope, yellowed at the corners, labeled in neat handwriting, "Mr. Hallam." She did not breathe. Mr. Hallam, the former steward, the one no one spoke of, the one she had only heard referenced in whispers during her brief tour. Dismissed? Gone? Dead? No one had said. She took the letter, slipped it into the pocket sewn into her skirts, closed the drawer. The door creaked behind her, but when she turned, the corridor was empty. Back in her room, she sat by the hearth and turned the envelope over in her hands. It bore no seal, no date. She did not open it. Not yet. It was enough for now to know it existed, a thread in a fabric she did not yet understand. Rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like a second heartbeat. Mina sat still, her silhouette framed by firelight and shadow. In this house of stone and silence, she felt the weight of everything unspoken, and yet she did not feel small. She had walked into this life with eyes open. The gown she wore was heavy on her shoulders, the title strange upon her name, but she would not let it consume her. Somewhere down the corridor she heard Julian's footsteps, measured, alone. She did not rise to follow. Not yet. She turned her gaze to the fire and let it burn. The first pale light of dawn drifted through the high windows of Ashford House, softening the severe lines of its corridors. It was a hesitant light, filtered by the mist that clung to Bath in the early hours, and it painted the parquet floors with long strokes of silver. Mina Havers moved quietly through this hushed world, her hands clasped before her, her steps measured yet purposeful. 2 days had passed since her arrival, yet each room still felt like an unopened book, its pages gilded but heavy with secrets. She had risen before the household, as she always had in her former life, and found solace in the silence. The air smelled faintly of beeswax polish and fading hyacinths from the conservatory. At intervals, the muffled clink of coal being delivered to the grates echoed like distant punctuation marks. She paused outside the steward's office, the envelope marked Mr. Hallam still concealed within the hidden pocket of her skirt. She had not yet dared to open it. It was like carrying a coal ember close to her heart, its warmth both threatening and reassuring. She pressed on, entering the breakfast room where a tray of tea had been laid out for her alone. She poured herself a cup, the porcelain trembling slightly against the saucer. Through the tall window she could see the gardens, grey and bare, their winter skeletons etched against the morning mist. The house slept on, but she knew the day would bring another round of quiet hostilities. By mid-morning the household had awakened. Servants passed her with shallow bows, eyes lowered but not blind. Mina had begun to sense the thin crust of loyalty among the underservants. A glance here, a quick smile there, but above them the air remained taut. The butler's voice, when it reached her, was always perfectly pitched yet cool. The maids who delivered linens to her chamber did so swiftly, as though proximity to her invited contagion. She decided to act. The steward's office, normally off-limits to a duchess unless summoned, was empty after luncheon. Mr. Growl had left for his weekly inspection of the stables. She stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The room smelled of ink and old paper, with a trace of dampness in the corners where the panelling met the floor. Rows of ledgers lined the shelves, each labelled in precise handwriting. She drew one at random, then another, laying them open on the mahogany desk. Her eyes moved swiftly, but carefully. Years of managing inventories and accounts for other households had taught her to read numbers as if they were gossip. Columns that should have matched did not. The same supplier appeared twice under different names. Coal deliveries were billed but not received. Cloth orders doubled and tripled without explanation. Some invoices bore a neat, unfamiliar signature, a curving E that reminded her of the way Everard Ashford had signed his name in the guest book. She traced it with a gloved finger, her pulse quickening. Footsteps approached. She snapped the ledgers shut just as Mr. Crowell entered. The steward was shorter than she, with a flushed face and round spectacles perched precariously on his nose. He carried a bundle of keys and a thin sheaf of papers, which he set down slowly. His darting eyes flicked from the ledgers to her. "Your Grace," he said, drawing out the title as though testing it. "I did not expect you in my office." Mina lifted her chin slightly. "The accounts of this house affect me as well as you, Mr. Crowell. I wish to understand them." He smiled, but it was a thin reptilian curve of the lips. "It is not customary for a lady, especially one newly arrived, to burden herself with figures. The dukedom's finances are complex, better left to those trained in such matters." "I was trained in hard work," Mina said softly, "and in recognizing when things do not add up." He tilted his head, his spectacles catching the lamplight. A duchess questioning her steward? His tone had the polish of civility, but an undercurrent of threat. "One might say it undermines the dignity of the household." "Or restores it," she replied. For a heartbeat, the air between them felt as taut as a drawn bow. His eyes flickered with something darker than irritation, perhaps recognition. He reached for his keys and jangled them softly, like a man soothing a dog. "I would advise your Grace to let such matters rest," he murmured. "Numbers can be misleading, people too." She held his gaze until he looked away. Then, with deliberate calm, she turned and left the office. Outside, the corridor smelled of lavender polish and cold stone. She drew a deep breath to steady herself. The house seemed to shift around her, its silence now an accomplice to the steward's veiled menace. Later, when she ventured into Bath to call upon the apothecary, she found the city's whispers had grown louder. The chemist's wife, who had once smiled at her when she was merely a maid, now gave a stiff curtsy and avoided her eye. Another customer, draped in furs, murmured audibly about upstart duchesses as Mina passed. Even the errand boy paused in sweeping to stare. At the charity committee meeting that afternoon, the frost sharpened. 3 ladies, their silk gowns rustling like wings, exchanged glances and pretended not to see Mina at all. When she spoke, suggesting an increase in donations to the hospital, they responded with practiced condescension, one remarking that newcomers should learn the customs before offering opinions. Mina felt the heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level, answering with courtesy sharpened to a blade. She would not give them the spectacle they craved. Returning to Ashford House, she found solace only in the underservants. A kitchen maid offered her a shy smile as she passed the scullery. An older footman, seeing her hesitate at a threshold, opened the door for her without being asked. These small gestures were like tiny candles in a long hallway. And the dowager. That evening, Mina carried a tray of tea herself to the dowager's sitting room. The older woman, still in morning black, sat near the window where the last of the daylight caught in her white hair. She accepted the tea without comment, but Mina noticed her hands trembled slightly less than before. They spoke of inconsequential things, weather, the garden's roses, and though the dowager's words were sparse, there was no coldness in them. When Mina rose to leave, a faint nod acknowledged her effort. It was not approval, but it was not rejection. Night came slowly, the mist thickening outside until the gas lamps glowed like blurred moons. Mina sat by the fire in her chamber, the envelope marked Mr. Hallam finally resting on her lap. The house had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that magnifies a heartbeat. She broke the seal with careful fingers. The letter was short, written in a hurried hand. Your Grace, if this reaches anyone who cares for truth, know that I leave Ashford House not by choice but from necessity. I've been pressured, threatened even, into silence. There are hands above me guiding what should be straight. I cannot remain. Protect what you can. Beware those who smile too easily. No signature beyond his name, no date, no direct accusation, but the weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone. She read it twice, then folded it again, her fingers trembling. In the mirror above the mantel she saw her own reflection, eyes wide but steady, shoulders squared. She was no longer a maid, merely bearing witness to the secrets of others. She was a duchess, standing in a house that seemed hollow but was full of hidden currents. And now she held a single piece of proof. Outside her window, the mist thickened to fog. The branches of the garden trees scratched faintly against the glass like a warning. Mina did not flinch. She tucked the letter back into her pocket, closer to her heart, and stared into the fire until its flames blurred. The warmth against her palms was not comfort, but resolve. The following afternoon unfolded under a pale sun. Its light filtered through a veil of thin clouds that softened the outlines of Bath's stone terraces. At Ashford House, the morning mist had withdrawn from the lawns, leaving beads of moisture trembling on the ivy that clung to the walls. The great windows reflected the sky's cool silver, and the gravel of the drive had been freshly raked, every trace of carriage wheels erased, as if the estate had not been restless through the night. Yet inside, the hush carried a weight Mina Havers was beginning to recognize, an expectancy, like a room holding its breath. She descended the grand staircase slowly, one hand gliding along the polished mahogany banister. Her navy walking gown whispered against each step, the fabric chosen deliberately to project composure. She had spent the morning with the dowager, coaxing her into a short conversation about the winter roses, and although the older woman's voice had been restrained, there had been no frost in it. That small victory lent Mina a fragile calm. Yet as she reached the entrance hall, she sensed a disturbance, subtle but undeniable. The butler's stance was too stiff, the footman at the door shifted from foot to foot, and the air seemed thick with an unspoken tension. The double doors opened without ceremony. A man stepped into the hall, his boots scattering tiny grains of gravel onto the marble floor. He removed his hat slowly, as though entering a stage rather than a home, and smiled. "Cousin Julian," he drawled, his voice smooth as polished mahogany. "I came at once upon hearing of your, how shall I say it, unexpected nuptials." Mina's fingers tightened on the banister. She had never seen him, but she knew at once who he was. Everard Ashford. The name had floated through conversations like a shadow, and now the shadow had form. He was of medium height, his build lean beneath a coat of midnight blue, cut in the Prince Albert style. A waistcoat of patterned brocade shimmered faintly beneath, and a jewelled pin glinted at his cravat. His hair, blonde but thinning at the temples, had been coaxed into careful waves, and his moustache was trimmed to a point. Yet it was his eyes that unsettled Mina, ice blue, bright with amusement, but edged with something sharper. Julian appeared at the far end of the hall, emerging from his study with a measured step. His black coat contrasted starkly with Everard's elegant display. He halted a few paces away, his expression guarded. "Everard," he said, "I did not summon you." "Nor need you," Everard replied, removing his gloves one finger at a time. "Family must be proactive when duty calls. Besides, the news in Bath travels faster than your letters." His gaze flicked to Mina with calculated curiosity. "And this must be the lady who saved your life." Mina descended the final steps, holding herself with quiet dignity. "Mina, Duchess of Wrentham," she said softly. Everard bowed, a movement precise but not humble. "A pleasure, Your Grace." His smile deepened, though his eyes did not warm. "I confess, I had imagined someone quite different, but life enjoys its ironies." Julian's jaw tightened. "We can speak in my study." "Of course," Everard said, "but surely your Duchess may remain? I bring tidings of the estate that concern you both." Mina felt the air between the two men thrum like a plucked string. Julian hesitated. The moment stretched. Finally he said, "Very well." They moved into the study, a room lined with shelves and shadowed by heavy draperies. The fire crackled in the grate but gave little warmth. Mina stood near the window, her hands clasped loosely, while Julian took his place behind the desk. Everard strolled to the mantel and examined a miniature portrait of the late Duke, his smile flickering with private amusement. "I hear whispers of unpaid accounts, of suppliers unsettled," Everard began, his tone light, conversational. "Such chatter reflects poorly on the family name. I thought it wise to offer my guidance. You know, cousin, I have experience smoothing troubled waters." Julian's dark eyes were fixed on him, unreadable. "You have experience creating them too," he said quietly. Everard laughed, a soft chime of sound. "Still sharp, even with a duchess to temper you." He glanced at Mina again, his gaze gliding over her like a measuring tape. "How are you finding Ashford House, Your Grace? It can be daunting at first." "It is a house," Mina said, her voice calm. "Whether it becomes a home remains to be seen." His smile faltered for an instant, then returned, spoken with admirable candor. "Perhaps candor will serve you where birth cannot." Julian's chair creaked as he rose. "That will do." Everard spread his hands, feigning innocence. "I merely wish to help. The steward, Crowell, is diligent, but perhaps overburdened. A man in my position could relieve some of that strain, discreetly, for the sake of the family." At the mention of Crowell, Mina's heartbeat quickened. She kept her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the window, but her ears caught every syllable. The suspicion she had nurtured since her confrontation with the steward flared brighter. Julian walked to the fireplace, his back to them both. "Crowell manages as instructed," he said. "I need no assistance." "Ah," Everard murmured, "but do you know what he manages?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Julian did not turn. Mina could almost feel his restraint, the tension in his shoulders, the silent struggle to maintain composure. Everard let the silence stretch, then moved closer to the desk. "Cousin, Bath is a city of whispers. Merchants talk, servants talk, even charity ladies talk. They say your new duchess is inquisitive. It would be a pity if her curiosity led her into uncomfortable truths." Mina shifted slightly, enough for Everard to notice. He inclined his head, acknowledging the reaction he had provoked. Julian turned at last, his expression carved from stone. "You presume much." "I presume nothing," Everard replied softly. "I observe, and I offer my help." Mina drew a slow breath. The study's atmosphere felt charged, the fire snapping sharply in the grate as though punctuating each exchange. She stepped forward a little, her voice steady. "If there are truths in this house, they should not be uncomfortable. They should be known." Everard's eyes glinted. "Such conviction," he said. "I can see why you fascinate him." Julian's face darkened. "Enough," he said. "Leave us." Everard smiled again, but this time his teeth showed faintly. "As you wish. I am staying at the Royal Crescent. Should you decide to accept my help, you know where to find me." He replaced his gloves with deliberate care, bowed once more to Mina, and left the room without haste. The door closed. The fire hissed. Julian remained by the desk, his hands gripping its edge. Mina watched him, the distance between them filled with unspoken words. Finally she said, "He knows more than he pretends, about Crowell, about the estate." Julian did not look at her. "Everard knows how to poison a room with half-truths. That is his gift. You cannot ignore him," she said quietly. His shoulders stiffened. "You think I have not tried?" Mina approached slowly, the hem of her gown whispering across the rug. She stopped a few feet from him. "Then try again, for the sake of this house, for the sake of your name." He lifted his head then, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something behind them. Fear, guilt, exhaustion. "You do not understand," he murmured. "Then help me," she said. "Help me understand." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the fire and the muted tick of the clock. His gaze lingered on her face, tracing the quiet strength there, the challenge laced with compassion. But instead of answering, he turned away, staring into the flames, as if they might speak for him. Mina stood still, the warmth of the hearth touching only the surface of her skin. In that silence, she felt the hollowness of the house more keenly than ever. The dust in the corners, the wary eyes of the servants, the ledgers filled with shifting numbers. And now a cousin with a serpent's smile had stepped across the threshold, offering help that smelled of threat. She folded her hands before her, her spine straight, her hazel eyes clear. If Julian would not act, she would watch, she would listen, she would not be silent. Outside the study window, the afternoon light faded to a muted gold, and the gardens lay still beneath a sky that promised rain. In the hall beyond, footsteps whispered like a secret carried from one room to another. The house had awakened to a new presence, and nothing within its walls felt steady anymore. Mina turned and left the study. As she closed the door behind her, the echo of it sounded like the start of something she could not yet name. But she felt it, the way a storm announces itself in the air long before the first drop falls. The morning air in Bath was clear and sharp, touched with frost, though the skies shone blue. From the windows of Ashford House, the city's crescents gleamed like polished bone, and chimney smoke curled gently into the crisp air. In the drawing-room, Mina stood before the mirror, fastening the last button of her plum-wool morning dress, the colour deep and sombre, but with just enough richness to suggest quiet dignity. Her hair had been pinned in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and a small brooch, pearl-scented, silver-edged, rested modestly at her throat. She adjusted the gloves over her wrists and took a breath, steadying her pulse. The invitation had been addressed to Mrs. Julian Ashford, a deliberate choice. Not Her Grace, not the Duchess of Wrentham. It was a subtle cruelty, one that did not escape her, but she had accepted nonetheless. She knew the stakes. The breakfast was hosted by Lady Standish, matron of Bath society and the silent architect behind many whispered scandals. Two other ladies would attend, Mrs. Holcombe, whose thin-lipped smile could slit paper, and Miss Leeming, whose family owned half the land surrounding the city's fashionable parks. They had supported Everard's political aspirations before his sudden withdrawal from the last race, and now they had set the table for something else, a performance. The carriage rolled through the city, past Georgian facades and tidy lampposts, the horses' hooves muffled by the fog. Mina sat upright, a thin layer of tension coiling between her shoulder blades. She would not let it rise to her throat. Her gloves were pressed flat in her lap, her eyes calm, her silence deliberate. Upon arriving at Standish House, the butler gave her a shallow bow. The footman took her coat without meeting her eyes. She was shown into the breakfast salon, a room washed in light, with wide French windows that opened to a frost-kissed garden. The three ladies were already seated, sipping tea from delicate cups rimmed in gold. "Ah," Lady Standish said, her voice high and powdery. "Mrs. Ashford, you've arrived." Mina curtsied. "Thank you for receiving me." They did not rise. They did not call her Duchess. A footman brought an extra chair, setting it slightly apart from the others. Mina took it without comment, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Lady Standish poured her tea with exquisite slowness. "We were just discussing the hospital's winter fund," she said. "A shame there has been so little progress. One must lean on reliable patrons, mustn't one?" Mrs. Holcombe added, "I do recall Lord Wrentham supported the hospital generously. But that was under the late Duke's administration." Miss Leeming, never one to resist the scent of blood, leaned forward. "Perhaps the new Duchess finds such matters unfamiliar." The words stung like vinegar on a wound, but Mina only smiled. "I believe concern for the suffering is never unfamiliar. One need not be born into nobility to understand mercy." A silence followed, brittle as glass. The ladies exchanged glances. Lady Standish reached for a sugared scone and bit into it with dainty malice. "The press has taken quite an interest in you. So curious that a maid should become a duchess, like a fable, isn't it?" Mrs. Holcombe murmured, "Though some fables end in tragedy, I believe." Mina held their gazes in turn, or in transformation. Her voice was low but firm. "The moral depends on the storyteller." The conversation drifted then, as conversations do when the challenge has been placed and no one dares pick it up. They spoke of the weather, of the upcoming concert series, of an unfortunate cousin's engagement. Mina sipped her tea, her back straight, her expression composed. But beneath her stillness, her mind moved swiftly. By the time she returned to Ashford House, the frost had begun to melt from the stone steps. She asked for pen and paper and composed a letter to the Bath Gazette, a donation to the hospital in the name of the Duke and Duchess of Wrentham, with an enclosed note requesting anonymity, which she knew would be politely ignored. The sum was modest by noble standards, but significant enough to be remarked upon, and it came not from the estate's coffers, but from a private account Julian had granted her to manage her personal affairs. She had used none of it until now. 2 days later, the Gazette printed a small column, tucked beside news of Parliament's delay on a trade bill. "A quiet but timely act of generosity has come from Ashford House," it read. "Though unnamed, we may safely suspect the Duchess of Wrentham, whose rise has made her the subject of fashionable gossip, is not unfamiliar with those in need." Lady Standish's household was known to receive the Gazette with their morning chocolate. Mina did not need to imagine the rustle of the paper in that breakfast salon. That evening, a strange hush fell over Ashford House, not from absence, but from a shift in the air. The footman who brought her tea offered a slight smile. One of the maids curtsied deeper than usual. Even Mr. Crowell passed her in the hall with a nod that was more acknowledgement than obligation. But it was Julian's behavior that surprised her most. He came to her chamber that night, not late, not unexpectedly. He knocked softly and stepped inside, still wearing his dark day coat. The fire had been lit, and the lamplight turned the room into a pool of quiet gold. "I read the Gazette," he said. She turned from the window, her hands folded at her waist. It was necessary. He remained near the door, as if unsure how far he was permitted to come. "You didn't ask my permission." "No," she said simply. A silence settled between them, not hostile, but uncertain. Then he said, "You handled them well." Mina looked at him carefully. Handled who? The wolves. He smiled faintly, then stepped closer, the fire catching in the silver at his temples. "You don't flinch, do you?" "Only when alone," she said. Julian's smile deepened, the kind that appeared slowly and disappeared even slower. "I would not have known how to respond had it been me." "But you would have borne it," Mina said. "You always bear things, even when you shouldn't." That stopped him. His gaze, dark and unreadable, met hers across the space between them. The fire crackled. "You think I'm weak," he said softly. "No," she replied. "I think you're wounded. There's a difference." For a moment they stood in silence, the fire warming their faces, casting long shadows behind them. The room seemed to breathe. Julian stepped closer, his voice hushed. "I have not thanked you." "For what?" "For reminding them, and me, that this house is not just stone and titles. It's alive again." Mina's breath caught slightly. She lowered her gaze only for a moment, then looked up again. "I don't know if it is, but I intend to try." Julian reached out, not touching her, but his hand hovered just beside hers, the heat of his skin palpable, even through her glove. He did not take her hand, not yet, but he stood close enough that she could feel the tension in him, not discomfort, but restraint. "I see you, Mina," he said, his voice low. "Not as they see you, as you are." She lifted her chin, her throat tightening. "And what am I?" He gave the barest shake of his head, as if the answer could not be said in words, only in silence, only in proximity. They stood like that for another long moment, the fire between them flickering and snapping, the air thick with the weight of everything unspoken. Then Julian stepped back, just enough to let her breathe again. "Good night, Your Grace," he said. She inclined her head, her voice almost a whisper. "Good night, Julian." When the door closed behind him, Mina did not move. She stood before the fire, her gloved hand resting against her own chest, where her heartbeat pulsed like a secret trying to escape. For the first time since her arrival, she did not feel alone in the house. She felt seen, not admired, not tolerated, but seen. And that, she thought, was the first real act of love anyone had offered her in a very long time. A soft rain fell upon the stones of Bath that morning, drawing silver veins across the windows of Ashford House. The air inside the manor was hushed, but not lifeless. It felt different now, no longer steeped in that weightless tension, but tinged with something new, something unspoken. The days had grown longer, and though the season had not yet turned, there was a scent in the air, faint, like the memory of spring beneath the earth. Mina stood in the library, surrounded by volumes so old their bindings whispered when touched. The fire crackled in the hearth, offering warmth that had little to do with the room's chill. On the table before her were 3 ledgers, open to pages that bore Crowell's signature. The ink was always the same, precise even, almost too perfect. She ran her fingers along the edge of the paper, her mind focused, her breath steady. Since that day in the steward's office, she had begun returning to the records whenever the house was quiet, often before sunrise. Each time she saw more, duplicated orders, names of suppliers that did not appear in the local registry, payment sums that shifted mysteriously between months. She had learned to read these pages the way she once read aristocratic expressions, measuring what was said against what was not. And beneath those numbers, a shadow kept forming. One name appeared again and again, EA Holdings, a venture firm she had never heard of, and yet its initials were far too familiar. She closed the ledger slowly, her hands firm but careful. That afternoon, as the rain softened to a drizzle, the Dowager Duchess requested tea in the west drawing room. Mina obliged personally, carrying the silver tray herself. The Dowager was seated near the window, wrapped in a shawl of soft grey wool. Her once severe features softened now by fatigue rather than disdain. "I hope you do not mind," Mina said gently as she poured. The The dowager offered a small nod. I find I mind fewer things these days. Mina smiled faintly and took the opposite chair. They sat for a moment in silence, listening to the soft patter of rain against glass. Then the dowager spoke, her voice distant. My husband used to sit here every morning before the war came. He would read the paper, never aloud, but always with small frowns. I never asked what he read. I regret that now. Mina lowered her gaze. Some men carry too much alone. The dowager looked at her with something close to sorrow. So do some women. Another silence passed between them, one not of distance but of shared knowledge. The dowager's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her cup. Tell me, Mina, she said at last, have you wondered about Mr. Hallam? Mina's fingers froze around her saucer. Yes, she answered. I have. The older woman nodded. He was loyal. Too loyal, perhaps. He came to me once, late, after the Duke had died, and said he'd found something troubling. I asked him to bring it to Julian, but he never did. Her voice faltered. The next day, he was gone. Mina leaned forward. Did he say what he found? The dowager shook her head. Only that it involved accounts and someone Julian trusted. I never pressed. I should have. She set down her cup. Her eyes, once so sharp, now carried a weariness that clung to every blink. I failed my son in many ways. I hid in mourning and left him to govern a house too large for grief. No one is meant to bear it alone, Mina said. The dowager looked at her for a long moment, then reached out. Her hand, cool and dry, rested atop Mina's. You are not what I expected, she whispered, and that is why I believe you will save him. Later that evening, Mina waited in the study until Julian returned from a ride. He entered with the scent of rain in his coat and droplets on his shoulders. He stopped when he saw her at his desk. I need your help, she said. She showed him the ledgers, line by line, name by name. She explained the patterns she had seen, the duplications, the disappearing sums. Julian listened in silence, his brow furrowed, his jaw set. This signature, she pointed, EA Holdings. Do you know it? His face changed, a flicker of comprehension, then of fury. Everard, he murmured. Mina nodded. He's hiding behind paper, using this house to line his pockets. Julian turned and walked to the fire. He braced one hand on the mantel, staring into the flames. I let him in. I gave him space to move freely, because he was family. Family should not poison the well they drink from, Mina said. He turned slowly to face her, and in his eyes was a storm, not just of anger but of shame. You found what I should have seen. Mina stood and came to stand beside him. The firelight played over his face, softening the hard lines that grief had carved. She reached for his hand, not as a duchess or an investigator, but as a woman who had once been invisible and now stood in the one place where she refused to vanish. He took her hand, slowly, with reverence. And when he bent and pressed his lips to it, there was no performance in the gesture. It was a vow, wordless and trembling. She did not pull away. Their eyes met in the quiet, the fire snapping softly behind them. Much later, long after he had gone to his own chambers, Mina sat before her bedroom hearth, the room golden and still. Her gloves lay folded on the escritoire, her hair unpinned. She stared into the flames, lost in thought. She remembered another fire, many years ago. Not in a manor, but in the back of a kitchen, where smoke curled from a hearth black with soot. She had been 13, no taller than the coal bin, scrubbing marble floors with hands so raw they bled. The mistress of the house had passed her without acknowledgement, and the footman had stepped over her as if she were a rug. That night, alone in the scullery, Mina had pressed her palms to her aching knees and whispered, "One day I will walk into a room and be seen." She had not known how or when or through what trial. She had not known what it would cost. But now, standing in a house full of portraits, bearing a title not given but earned, she understood. To be seen was not to be praised, it was to be known. And she was known, by him, by this place, by herself. She reached for the letter from Mr. Hallam, still tucked in her journal. She read it again, the ink smudged at one edge, the words trembling with fear and truth. And then, with quiet purpose, she rose. Tomorrow they would begin the next step, together. But for now, she let the fire warm her hands and her heart. The morning broke bright and cold, with the kind of sunlight that made the frost on the window panes shimmer like threads of silver lace. Ashford House stirred slowly, its walls still softened by the hush of winter, but something within its corridors had begun to change. Something subtle and almost imperceptible, like the faintest turn of wind before a storm. Mina stood before the tall mirror in her chamber, fastening the final clasp of her gown. The fabric, sapphire blue silk with a fitted bodice and modest lace at the collar, hugged her form like a secret. It was not a gown meant for spectacle, but it held elegance nonetheless, a quiet confidence, unornamented and firm. Her hair had been swept into a loose knot, with a few strands falling naturally around her temples. She had not meant to look beautiful, and yet she did. There was a soft knock at the door. She turned. Julian stood at the threshold, dressed not in his usual black, but in a dark grey frock coat, his waistcoat of deep forest green, a subtle nod to life returning. His gaze rested on her for a moment longer than etiquette permitted. "I came to escort you to breakfast," he said, his voice low. "If you would like that." She nodded. "Yes, I would." They walked side by side through the corridor, their steps synchronized in silence. As they entered the morning room, sunlight spilled across the table, illuminating the silver service and freshly cut bread, still warm from the kitchen. For once, they were alone. No servants lingered at the edges of the room. The moment belonged to them. Julian poured her tea. Mina reached for the marmalade. Their hands brushed. Neither pulled away. There was something in the air between them, no longer uncertainty, but gravity. A slow pull. They spoke softly of small things. The weather, a letter from a neighboring estate, a book he had left unread for years. But beneath each word lay something deeper. The ease of two people no longer performing civility, but allowing space for honesty. At one point, Julian reached for his cup and paused. "That gown," he said, "it suits you." Mina lifted her eyes. "Does it?" He nodded, holding her gaze. "It reminds me that you don't merely exist in this house, you fill it." Her heart fluttered like the hem of a curtain caught in a breeze. And then, as though drawn by something older than speech, Julian rose. He came to her slowly, every step deliberate, until he stood beside her chair. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and for a moment they said nothing. He bent gently and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of hunger or possession. It was a kiss of quiet revelation, a kiss that asked nothing but gave everything. When he pulled back, his hand lingered at her jaw, his thumb brushing a strand of hair away from her cheek. She did not look away, but that serenity shattered before the hour passed. Later that morning, as Mina crossed the corridor leading to the South Library, she found herself alone with Mr. Crowell. He stood at the far end of the hallway, arms folded, expression blank. The steward had always made her uneasy, but today his stillness carried something darker. He stepped forward. "Your Grace," he said, though the title felt like mockery in his mouth. "A word, if I may." Mina stopped. "Make it brief." Crowell's mouth twitched, but it did not become a smile. "You carry yourself well, better than expected, I'll admit, but don't mistake tolerance for acceptance. A silk gown does not make a duchess, nor does the attention of a grieving man make you anything more than a temporary comfort." Her spine stiffened. "You speak out of turn." "Do I?" he replied, his voice laced with venom. "I have served this house for over 2 decades. I've known the Ashford blood since Julian was a boy, and I know what it is, and what it isn't. The gentry may smile at you now, but it will not last. Sooner or later, even he will remember what you are." Mina met his gaze. "What I am," she said, "is a woman who has seen more truth in silence than you ever have in servitude." Crowell's jaw tightened. Truth does not matter in the eyes of Parliament, only perception. And soon, even perception will turn against you. He stepped aside, bowing with a rigid sweep. Mina walked past him, her shoulders unshaken. But his words trailed behind her like a shadow. That evening the letter arrived. Julian found it on his desk, delivered by private courier, bearing the seal of a solicitor from London. He read it once, then again. His fingers clenched around the paper, and when Mina entered the room moments later, his expression was a mask of fury. He handed her the letter. Everard Ashford had filed an official petition with Parliament, questioning Julian's capacity to govern the estate. The petition cited financial mismanagement under emotional duress, and the sudden impulsive marriage to a woman of undocumented origin and social instability. In short, Everard was attempting to have Julian removed as Duke of Wrentham and to take the title himself. Mina read the letter slowly, her breath thickening in her chest. When she reached the final lines, her hands trembled, not from fear, from rage. Julian turned away, his voice tight. "He means to strip everything from me. From us." She stepped toward him. "Then we do not let him." His eyes met hers, and for the first time they were not clouded by grief or silence. They burned, but beneath the fire there was something else, a flicker of doubt. "He has power," Julian said quietly, "connections in Parliament, and Crowell, I now suspect, has been feeding him from our own ledgers for years." Mina reached out and touched his arm. The gesture was simple, solid. "Then we fight him, not with scandal, not with fear, but with truth, with everything he's never had." Julian's voice broke. "And if that's not enough?" She stepped closer. "Then we lose with honor, together." They stood in silence, the fire casting gold over their skin. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and somewhere beyond the gates of Ashford House the city whispered. But within these walls, a line had been drawn, not in ink or blood, but in trust. Not yet love, not yet, but something very near it, and far more dangerous. A wind rose over Bath that morning, harsh and bitter, bending the skeletal trees in the gardens and rattling the old glass panes of Ashford House. The warmth of the hearth no longer reached the corners of the rooms, and even the grand hallways carried a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the kind of wind that carried news, sudden, sweeping, and cruel. Mina stood by the window in the breakfast room, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she had not touched. A folded newspaper sat on the table beside her. Its headline glared back in bold type, sharp as a dagger. "Duchess or Deception? The Mysterious Marriage That Divides Bath." The article beneath it was filled with insinuations that she had bewitched Julian, that she had hidden her past, that she had risen from the scullery by way of seduction, not merit. It quoted unnamed sources, cited whispers at musicales, and ended with a question meant to provoke rather than inform. Mina's hands did not shake. She was past trembling. Across the house, servants whispered behind doors that closed too softly. Faces that had once smiled now avoided her gaze. And above all, the corridors felt emptier, quieter. The Dowager Duchess had fallen ill the night before. A fainting spell, they said, brought on by the shock of the news. She had not woken since. The physician had come at dawn. His expression had been grave. And Julian had not come to her. He had disappeared into his study after reading the paper, shutting the door so quietly it felt like a farewell. She had not seen him since. It was not the coldness that hurt. It was the silence. By noon, word had come that Mr. Crowell was missing. The steward had left the estate in the early hours, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. A coachman later reported he had taken the road south toward the river district. The house staff began to murmur. First in confusion, then in fear. Mina did not retreat. Instead, she summoned Mr. Pritchard, the under-butler who had served the family for over 30 years. She met him in the butler's pantry, the same narrow space where whispers had once turned against her. "I need your help," she said. He looked at her, really looked, and nodded. "What must I do, Your Grace?" She laid out the pattern of theft, the false suppliers, the falsified signatures. She showed him the notations Kral had made in the ledgers and the route she believed he had taken with the missing documents. They called upon Dr. Fielding, the physician who had long tended to the Dowager. Mina told him everything, about the corruption, about the press, about the petition in Parliament. The doctor listened without interrupting, then placed a hand gently over hers. "I will speak to the magistrate," he said, "but you must be careful. You walk a fine edge." She turned next to Mr. Galley, the grocer who had extended credit to the household during the worst of winter. She told him the truth. He sent a runner to his cousin, who worked near the river docks. By nightfall, Mina stood near the back steps of Ashford House, cloaked in a heavy travelling coat and gloves. The lantern she held flickered in the wind. Julian had still not come. She did not know if he would, but she would go regardless. The narrow streets along the river were slick with rain. Smoke rose in thick coils from warehouses and dockyards, and the smell of fish and coal mixed with rotting wood. Shadows moved quickly in the alleys, but Mina did not falter. She followed Mr. Galley's cousin, a broad-shouldered man named Edwin, to a crumbling warehouse with a rusted sign hanging askew. Inside, the air was damp and sour. A single lantern flickered near Crowell was there. He sat at a desk surrounded by papers, ink bottles, and 2 satchels, one of which bore the Ashford seal. When he saw her, his eyes widened. "Your Grace," he said, rising, "you should not be here." Mina stepped forward, unafraid. "You ran with lies. I came with truth." He narrowed his eyes. "You're no duchess." "No," she replied. "I'm a woman who has nothing left to lose, and that makes me dangerous." Kral's jaw twitched. "You don't understand what you've stepped into." "I understand enough," she said. "You were feeding Everard from within these walls. You signed false orders. You bled this house dry under the pretense of duty." "He promised me protection," Kral spat. "He said I'd be secure once Julian was out." "And what did he promise once the name of Ashford was ruined?" Kral's mouth opened, but no words came. Behind her, heavy boots echoed against the stones. Magistrate Hobbs, flanked by 2 constables, entered the warehouse. His face was stern, his gloves soaked with rain. "Mr. Crowell," he said, "you will come with us." The steward paled. His hands twitched toward the papers, but Mina stepped between him and the desk. "No more running," she said. He was escorted out in silence. As the constables loaded the satchels and documents into the carriage, Mina stepped outside, drawing her coat tighter against the wind. She watched the horses shift restlessly, watched Crowell seated beside the magistrate, no longer smug, no longer threatening, just pale, just small. The man who had once spoken poison into her ear now looked like nothing more than a faded figure on a forgotten page. Mina did not speak. She did not need to. By the time she returned to Ashford House, the rain had stopped. The windows glowed with faint light, and a hush had fallen over the estate once more. She stepped through the door, mud on her boots, her gloves damp, her face pale with exhaustion. A maid met her in the entrance hall, eyes wide with something close to reverence. "His Grace is waiting," the girl whispered. Mina nodded but did not yet move toward him. Instead, she looked up at the grand staircase, then toward the corridor that led to the Dowager's chambers. There was still more to do. But tonight, she had won something that could not be taken away. Her voice, her name, her ground, and nothing, no scandal, no title, no paper sealed in wax, could strip it from her again. The gas lamps of Ashford House burned brighter than they had in months. The sconces lining the entrance hall shimmered with polished brass, and the marble floor beneath Mina's shoes gleamed like still water under moonlight. A hush lingered just beneath the hum of arriving guests. A tension not of gossip, but of expectation. Mina stood atop the grand staircase in a gown of deep violet satin, her only adornment a cameo brooch pinned at her collar, inherited from a mother who once scrubbed the same stone steps she now descended with regal poise. Behind her, the newly restored gallery waited, its ceiling repaired, its paneling revarnished, the chandeliers relit like constellations reclaimed from darkness. She had chosen this room for a reason. It was where the ceiling had once fallen, where scandal had found her, where the murmur of judgment had grown teeth, and now it would witness her rising, not as a servant nor a duchess by scandal, but as a woman who dared to stand unbroken. Julian watched her from the foot of the stairs. He was dressed in evening black, his cravat a sharp fold of snowy linen, his signet ring polished but weighty upon his hand. Pride softened the sternness of his brow, though his hands remained tightly clasped behind his back. Mina could see the war within him, admiration, worry, and a fierce desire to shield her, though he knew she no longer needed a protector. "You're certain of this?" he asked quietly as she reached him. "No," she answered, her voice low but sure. "But I am certain I must." He nodded and offered his arm. Together they walked into the lion's den. The elite of Bath had come dressed in their finest silks and hypocrisies. Jewels sparkled at every throat, and fans fluttered like nervous birds. The gallery, once a wound in the estate's pride, had been reborn as a stage. At its center stood a polished harp and a string quartet already tuning their instruments. The Dowager Duchess, clad in charcoal grey trimmed with soft lilac, sat erect in her armchair, her chin held high. Though illness had weakened her body, her eyes burned with lucid strength. She had chosen to attend, no longer to hide in shadows, but to show the world where her loyalty lay. Mina stepped forward as the first notes of music settled the room into silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, though her heart beat with the force of every cruel word ever whispered behind her back. "I thank you for gracing Ashford House tonight. Many of you stood witness to a moment that changed my life. Tonight, I ask you to witness another." Murmurs rippled. One lady dropped her fan. Mina continued, "You came here expecting music, and you shall have it. But before strings can swell and voices rise, I must speak, not as a duchess, nor as a name dragged through broadsheets, but as a woman who chose truth when silence was more convenient." From the corner of her eye, she saw Julian watching her, not with tension but awe. She lifted the sealed ledger from the table beside her. "This book," she said, raising it for all to see, "contains records altered to conceal embezzlement, debts falsely attributed to this household, and investments used to fund ambitions unfit for any nobleman. The architect of this deception stands among us tonight." All eyes turned. Julian stepped forward now, his voice cutting the quiet like a blade. "Everard Ashford," he said, and his cousin, still smiling, still sipping his sherry, froze. "You used my title to gain favour in Parliament. You threatened my wife, manipulated my steward, and nearly drove my estate into ruin. Tonight your legacy ends." Gasps erupted. Some ladies stood. A gentleman dropped his glass. Everard paled. "This is slander," he spat, his voice rising above the din. "She is nothing. She bewitched you. The entire city knows." Julian raised a hand, silencing the room. "She is my wife. She is the Duchess of Wrentham, and every accusation against you is documented and sworn." The magistrate stepped from the back of the room, flanked by two officers. Everard backed away, fury twisting his once handsome features. "This house, this title, it should have been mine." "And it never will be," Julian said calmly. As the officers closed in, a quiet movement near the far wall caught Mina's eye. A man stood there, older, thinner than she remembered from the steward's portrait, but unmistakably Mr. Hallam. His eyes met hers, and he gave a single, solemn nod before slipping out through the side door, unseen by all but her. Mina's throat tightened. The truth had not only unmasked a villain, it had set a ghost free. The early light of spring spilled across Ashford House like a benediction. Its great windows, once dulled by dust and silence, gleamed beneath the morning sun. The stone facade, weathered noble, seemed to stand taller now, no longer bowed beneath the weight of scandal or sorrow. It was a house that had endured whispers, betrayal, grief, and now it breathed again. In the rose garden, the Dowager Duchess sat quietly beneath the arbour, wrapped in a shawl of soft green wool. A book rested in her lap, though her eyes rarely touched the page. Instead, they lingered on the new blossoms unfurling around her. For the first time in years, her posture was not guarded, but relaxed, her gaze not lost, but focused. She turned her head slightly at the sound of footsteps and did not flinch. Mina approached from the west path, a wide-brimmed hat shading her brow, a pair of shears tucked into the basket on her arm. She moved with practiced grace, neither hurried nor hesitant, and nodded with quiet respect to the woman who had once judged her unworthy. The dowager returned the nod. They no longer needed words. The servants, too, had changed. They no longer stiffened at Mina's approach or exchanged glances behind her back. They bowed with true acknowledgement, some even with a hint of pride. Mina had walked their corridors, lifted their burdens, remembered their names. She had spoken with the scullery maid about aching feet, shared a moment of silence with the under-butler when his father passed, and smiled at the laundress on wash day. Her dignity was not worn like a jewel. It lived in her every motion. Inside the house, laughter echoed from the kitchens. The accounts ledger, once a tangle of deceit, now reflected order and fairness. Tradesmen no longer hesitated to do business with Ashford. The tenants had seen repairs completed, roofs replaced, rents made reasonable. There was talk in the village that this duchess, this unexpected duchess, had brought more than beauty or scandal. She had brought purpose. In the study, Julian stood at the window watching the garden below. He had changed as well. Gone was the shadowed man who haunted his own hallways. He no longer lingered behind doors or vanished into his thoughts. He spoke plainly now, even smiled on occasion. The stiffness in his shoulders had eased. He had made peace with grief, not by burying it, but by making room for something else beside it. He watched Mina pause at a rosebush, her gloved fingers gently coaxing a new bloom into shape. The breeze lifted a lock of her dark hair and carried it across her cheek. She brushed it aside with a motion so familiar, so heartbreakingly hers, that Julian could not remain behind the glass. He descended the steps and crossed the lawn to her. She looked up as he approached, but she did not startle. Her expression was serene, but watchful, as though she were always preparing for the next moment to matter. Julian drew a breath. "You've tamed the thorns," he said softly. Mina tilted her head. "They were never the enemy. They were just protecting something." He nodded. Then, slowly, he reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat and drew out a simple gold ring. Her wedding band. The same one he had placed on her hand in haste, under pressure, when scandal had wrapped around them like smoke. That day, the gesture had been necessity. Today, it was something else. "I would like," he said, voice low, "to give this to you again. Not as payment for courage, not as protection from whispers, but because I wish to share every day that follows with you, with your mind, your heart, your maddening ability to see what I refuse to face." Mina did not move, except to extend her hand. He slipped the ring onto her finger slowly, reverently. "No scandal," she murmured. "No obligation," he echoed. "Only choice." They stood in silence, the ring now warm on her hand, the air between them charged not with doubt, but with something rarer, trust earned through trial. That afternoon, they walked the royal crescent. Bath shimmered under the early spring sun, its stone curves and terraces a soft gold. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, carriages rattling, shopkeepers calling out prices, schoolchildren giggling at the edge of the green. But Julian and Mina moved through it like a world apart. Their arms brushed, their strides matched. Mina wore a gown the colour of sun-drenched parchment, and her bonnet was fastened loosely beneath her chin, allowing strands of hair to catch in the wind. Julian, in a tailored navy coat and dove-grey cravat, carried his walking stick more as formality than need. When they reached the centre of the crescent, Mina paused. The sky above was vast and pale, tinged with lavender and the promise of rain far in the distance. She looked upward, her eyes bright but shadowed by something older than the day. "There were years," she said quietly, "when I could walk an entire street and not be seen. Not truly. Not even when I bowed. Not even when I bled." Julian turned to face her. "I see you, Mina. I saw you long before I understood what that meant, and now—" His voice thickened. "I cannot imagine a day without seeing you." She met his gaze. Her lips trembled, but she did not look away. "I see you too, Julian. Not just the man who carries a title or wears grief like a second skin. I see the man who listens, who learns, who stood beside me even when he doubted everything." His hand brushed her cheek, a feather-light touch that spoke of reverence rather than possession. They did not kiss. They did not need to. They simply stood together as the breeze passed, as the world spun on, and as the weight of what had come before finally loosened its grip. Ashford House awaited them at the end of their walk, its windows aglow, the household alive with new rhythm. Inside, the dowager sipped her tea by the fire and marked her page with a pressed violet. The servants polished silver not in tension but in pride. In the village, a letter was pinned to the church notice board, signed by both the Duke and Duchess of Wrentham, announcing a new initiative for tenant education and apprenticeships. Nothing had come easy, but everything had come true. And as Mina stepped through the threshold of her home, hand in hand with the man she had once feared, she smiled, not for the world, not for propriety, but for herself. The house, the marriage, the duchy. It all began again, not by mistake, but by choice. Ashford House breathed in sunlight. The great oaks surrounding the estate had thickened with age, casting longer shadows across the lawns. The rose garden, once sparse and neglected, now bloomed in every hue, from palest blush to deepest crimson, as if making up for years of silence. The gravel paths were well tended, and the air carried the scent of earth, lavender, and something gentler still, peace hard-won. It was a warm morning in early May, and the windows were thrown open to the breeze. Inside the drawing-room, a child's laughter rang out, light and sudden, like birdsong. A little girl, no older than 4, darted between the chairs, her black curls bouncing, a ribbon askew on her shoulder. She wore boots, far too fine for mud, but had found it anyway, judging by the trail of prints behind her. "Mama!" she cried, clutching a linen doll in one hand. "Papa says the kittens are opening their eyes." From the doorway, Mina smiled. She no longer wore the tentative expression of a woman proving her place. Time had sculpted her into something even more graceful, less polished perhaps, but with a radiance that could not be learned. Her dark hair was pinned in a looser fashion these days, strands always escaping. A brooch glinted at her collar, a tiny sapphire, no larger than a teardrop. "Then we must go at once," she said solemnly. "The kittens will not wait for manners." The girl shrieked with delight and ran back toward the garden. Mina turned as Julian entered behind her, brushing dust from his coat. His hair had grown silver at the temples, and laughter lines deepened at the corners of his eyes. But he was stronger now, anchored. He wore contentment as naturally as he once wore sorrow. "She's inherited your curiosity," he murmured, watching the little figure disappear into the hedges. "And your stubbornness," Mina replied, raising a brow. They smiled at each other in that way only people do who have crossed a wilderness hand in hand. Their second child, a son named Samuel, slept in the nursery upstairs. Born small and quiet, He had grown into a wide-eyed, solemn infant who rarely cried but clutched Mina's finger with a grip as fierce as Julian's love for them both. The household had changed too. Mr. Pembroke, once an under-butler, now served as steward, loyal and sharp-eyed. Cook still grumbled about sugar shortages, but had taken to humming as she kneaded dough. The maids were paid fair wages, and no one in the house feared speaking their mind, though they spoke of Mina and Julian with reverence, not just respect. The Dowager Duchess had passed the previous winter. She'd gone quietly in the night, with Mina's hand in hers and a rose tucked beside her pillow. In her final weeks, she had dictated a letter to be read after her death, a message of thanks to Mina, not only for restoring the house, but for teaching her how to live again when she had long since chosen to fade. Everard, disgraced and stripped of claim, had vanished from public life after serving his sentence. Rumours said he had sailed to India. Others claimed he now worked under an assumed name in London, a man forever shunned by the very society he once manipulated. Crowell, sentenced to transportation, had died en route to the colonies from illness. His end was not mourned. Bath itself had softened. Change arrived slowly, but Mina had helped usher it in. She had opened a charitable school near the lower market for girls of working-class families. Her influence made it fashionable for other ladies to donate not just funds, but time. What began as whispers of scandal had become quiet admiration, then open praise. She had become the Duchess they did not expect. But more than that, she had become a woman who did not need the title to be seen. That evening, when the lamps were lit and the children tucked into bed, Julian found Mina alone in the gallery, the same gallery where their story had begun. The ceilings had long since been repaired, the plasterwork restored in careful detail. Music filled the room now, not with grand performances, but with the quiet joy of their lives, soft piano notes drifting from the parlour, the clink of china, distant footsteps, the laughter of their daughter echoing in the halls. Julian came to her side. "She asked me tonight," Mina said softly, "if I was always a duchess." Julian watched her profile in the flickering light. "What did you say?" "I told her the truth, that I was once a maid who dared to speak, and that one day someone listened." He touched her hand, the one that wore the same gold band he had placed on her finger 5 years before. "She will grow up knowing she can become anything," he said, "because she will have seen what you became." Mina looked up at him, eyes warm with tears, but not sorrow. "And what of you? What did you become?" "Julian Ashford." He smiled, brushing a kiss against her knuckles. "I became yours." They stood in silence, not needing to fill it. Outside, the stars bloomed across the velvet sky. Inside, time had left its mark not as a scar, but as a signature, a testament. The duchy had survived, the house had healed, and love, real, hard-earned, tender, had not only endured the weight of scandal and grief, but had grown roots, flowered, borne fruit. Not by accident, not by obligation, but by choice. And so it ended, as all great stories should, not with a grand fanfare, but with two souls side by side, in a room once broken by fate, and now filled with light. Together, always. Sometimes life chooses the most unexpected people to carry the heaviest titles and the most beautiful truths. Mina's journey was never about pearls or titles. It was about courage. The courage to speak when no one listens, to stand when the world would rather you kneel, and to love even when you fear you do not belong. Julian had status, wealth, and lineage, but without love, without humility, he was only a shadow. And through Mina's quiet dignity, he learned the most human of lessons, that devotion is not born of obligation, but of choice. If you, too, believe that love is not defined by birth, but by bravery, then this story was written for you. Let us know what touched you most in the Duchess they did not expect, and if you made it all the way to the end, write the word visible in the comments. Because that's what Mina became, and what we all long to be. truly seen. If you believe in stories that uplift, challenge, and inspire, consider leaving a super thanks to support the team that brings these historical romances to life. Any amount you feel moved to give helps us continue creating tales that stir the soul. And if you're not able to contribute in that way right now, sharing this video with someone who loves powerful stories is another wonderful gift. Your voice helps this community grow. You'll find more unforgettable love stories linked right here in the cards. Don't stop dreaming, feeling, or believing, because love, true love, always finds a way. Thank you for watching.